This op-ed in today's Wall Street Journal. That just might be the worst thing written yet in the neocon canon. That's saying something. According to columnist Bret Stephens, the Iran interim diplomacy deal is, quote, worse than Munich. When Stephens invokes Munich, he is talking about when, in 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain signed the Munich Pact, which was a de facto peace agreement with Hitler. Now, there's something called Godwin's Law you may have encountered on the internet, which essentially says that when you get into a debate on the internet about, well, anything, if you mention Hitler or the Nazis at any time, you've automatically lost whatever debate you were having. And what this means is that if you have a tendency to say stuff like, this is just like Hitler, when you're having an argument, it means you're not really arguing the case very effectively. Hitler is what you say when you're losing an argument. Whether it's Bret Stephens, who wrote the interim nuclear agreement signed in Geneva on Sunday by Iran, the six big powers, has many of the flaws of Munich, or Daniel Pipes over at the National Review Online calling the interim deal with Iran, quote, one of those rare occasions when comparison with Munich in 1938 is valid. But of course, neoconservatism has always rested on a foundation explicitly of some version of Godwin's Law.
This is a sham from beginning to end. It's the worst deal since Munich.
Bin Laden and his terrorist allies have made their intentions as clear as Lenin and Hitler before them. The question is, will we listen?
We've got Chavez in Venezuela with a lot of oil money. He's a person who was elected legally, just as Adolf Hitler was elected legally.
I've often used that precise analogy of Hitler and Mein Kampf as a reason why we should take threatening rhetoric seriously, particularly in the case of terrorism and Saddam Hussein.
If every enemy the U.S. faces is Hitler, if every bit of diplomacy is appeasement, then we must be, as a people, in perpetual war. Luckily, Americans have largely rejected that worldview, but I'm curious to hear from someone who still holds to it. Paul Wolfowitz was the Deputy Secretary of Defense under George W. Bush, an administration that brought us two wars. He's currently a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative think tank, and he joins me now. Mr. Wolfowitz, my first question to you is, given the fact there was a kind of reformist regime in Iran 10 years ago during the Bush administration, why weren't you guys in the Bush administration able to get this deal done a decade ago?
Let me just ask, I take it you think it's a mistake to take bin Laden's rhetoric seriously or Saddam Hussein's rhetoric seriously. That's the implication of your introduction here.
No, I just don't think they're Hitler.
I know what said they were, but when they threaten violence against the United States, it should be taken seriously.
Sure, take it seriously, but we shouldn't go to war. We should not go to war with Saddam Hussein.
That's a different question, but you're mocking the idea of taking someone's rhetoric seriously.
I'm not mocking the idea of taking someone's rhetoric seriously. You can take people's rhetoric seriously, but there's a few things to add into that, right? Strategic calculations about what someone's going to do, right? People can have bad rhetoric, but actually use that rhetoric for domestic purposes or political purposes that don't indicate what they're actually going to do on a strategic world stage, A. And B, the rhetoric being taken seriously when invoked
Chris,
in the
I'm
context...
asking you, are you saying that bin Laden's rhetoric was not to be taken seriously?
I do not necessarily think that all of the rhetoric coming out of Iran is an indication of what their desire is in terms of their nuclear program or their designs on Israel. You
no
think...
one says it is a complete design.
Yes,
or that
they
rhetoric
do.
Isn't some...
Benjamin Netanyahu says that all the time.
Well, I'm not here to argue Benjamin Netanyahu. I am here to say, since you started this on that foot, to mock the idea of taking threatening rhetoric seriously is a liberal mistake, if you like. Of course, Hitler is close to unique. Fair enough.
Close to unique. But here's the question, right? What does taking rhetoric seriously mean? I think you and I can agree in the abstract, sure, take rhetoric seriously. But when saying taking rhetoric seriously, and you see this invoked in the Iranian case all the time, because we had one of the leaders of the regime say something about Israel being a barking dog, right? Taking the rhetoric seriously is then meant as an indication they aren't serious about diplomacy, which is then used as an argument that there's a military solution as opposed to a diplomatic one. Right?
No, it just says it's part of the equation. And you know, to be honest, one of the things that's a little shocking is to hear how often people have welcomed the mushy, fuzzy, vague rhetoric of Rouhani as indicating some kind of fundamental change in Iranian attitude. Look, I think the real point is, forget the rhetoric. One of the problems is we made too much of vague promises which we know are easily reversed. Just on Sunday, Secretary of State Kerry was asked on a different network, I won't advertise their name here,
Okay.
what about the comparison between this deal and the deals with North Korea? And he said, oh, they're completely different. North Korea was a member of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. North Korea renounced Iran is a member of the NPT. Iran has renounced nuclear weapons. Iran is negotiating. Well, excuse me, North Korea was a member of the NPT until after 10 years they decided to leave it. Iran can leave it. Every one of those three things that Kerry mentioned are rhetoric which is reversible.
This is precise.
Would you let me finish this time? Thanks. What is needed is concrete dismantling of their program, not promises, not words.
So then how do you achieve that?
And there's nothing in this agreement that does that.
First of all, there is something concrete, which is they're going to dissolve the 20% enriched uranium. They're going to rig it back down to 5%.
Which is reversible. It's easily reversible.
Sure, everything's reversible, right?
Not everything, no.
Okay, so then the question is for you, short of war, short of a disastrous, absolutely horrific abomination that would lead to the deaths of thousands of people in the region, a repeat of the worst thing I've seen in my lifetime, which is the Iraq War. Short of that, what is the solution then?
You know, there is an alternative, which is to maintain the sanctions, maintain the pressure, insist on an agreement that really reverses this nuclear program of theirs, and not suddenly believe promises when we have evidence over the last 10 years that they have every intention of developing nuclear weapons. So then let's say you don't believe it. Then what next? Then what do you do? You keep the pressure on. You don't let it up and say we've got this great diplomatic achievement, which is also, by the way, going to come back and haunt you in 6 months. If the atmosphere is so good, if the progress is so great, then why don't you just keep continuing down this road? That's what happened with North Korea. That is the comparison Kerry doesn't want to accept, but that's how we got into that situation with North Korea.
North Korea and Iran, this is exactly the kind of thinking that I'm so fascinated, right? Because North Korea and Iran are vastly different states. I mean, North Korea really is sui generis. The Iranians are a good deal more clever, actually. The Iranians will negotiate their way out of this much more cleverly than the North Koreans do. But you don't think there's a different set of incentives for the nation, the Islamic Republic of Iran, than there is for the Hermit Kingdom of North Korea? Of course, they're different. You keep changing the subject. The point is you can't rely. No, that is the subject, because you keep rely on the promises of either one. And as far as the ambitions, this agreement has verification built into it, doesn't it? Chris, if Iran isn't after nuclear weapons, then why are they developing long-range ballistic missiles? They make no sense unless you put a nuclear weapon on them. Frankly, if you believe they're not after nuclear weapons, then I guess you can negotiate anything. I don't know. I think the question is, if you concede they're after nuclear weapons, something that I simply don't know. I haven't looked in the intelligence, right? If you concede they are after it, and the goal is to make sure they don't acquire nuclear weapons, A, and B, to not go to war, right? And those two goals are equally important in my mind. Then what do you do that doesn't look like this agreement? This agreement, to me, looks like a pretty good path. What you do is you maintain the pressure, you maintain the sanctions. The sanctions are obviously biting and obviously hurting them much more than they're hurting us at all. This regime is shaky. This regime is having trouble at home. And frankly, another thing I would do, which is important here, I would not abandon the people of Iran the way we have, not only under this president, but to a sorry extent, I would say, over the last 20 years. I'm glad you raised. The people of Iran are the greatest hope for change in that country. I agree, and I would like to respond finally here, because you've said that before, and I have been awed by some of the courage of Iranian dissidents. There's a guy by the name of Akbar Ganji, I'm sure you're familiar with him, wrote these groundbreaking chronicles of murders by the regime of dissidents. Incredibly brave, noble person. He and many other dissidents, as reported by Eli Lake in the Daily Beast, say they welcome this. They welcome this deal. There are dissidents in Iran, the people who oppose the regime, who think this deal can give daylight. And there are plenty of dissidents who are afraid that this deal is going to legitimize the regime. Look, I'd feel more comfortable at that position if I thought this government was taking seriously the situation of dissidents in Iran, instead of basically, or in Syria for that matter, we've abandoned the Syrian people to Iran's ally in Damascus. It's shameful, and it's going to come back and haunt us. You don't want a war, I don't want a war, but a bad negotiating outcome can lead to a war just as much as too much belligerence. Former Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, appreciate you coming on. Thank you. We'll be right back.